My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 8 years working in what most people would call consulting. That's the safe word we use. The boring word. The word that makes people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties when they ask what I do for a living. But on the afternoon of September 12th, standing in my childhood kitchen in Bakersfield, California, watching my mother count out $20 bills on the same scratched Formica counter where I used to do homework, I wasn't a consultant. I wasn't anything my family recognized. I was just their disappointing daughter who'd somehow failed to launch after college, living in what they assumed was a fantasy world of government paperwork and travel that never seemed to amount to anything they could brag about to the neighbors. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The house smelled exactly the same as it had 15 years ago. Pine Sol, and my father's Old Spice aftershave, with the faint, metallic tang that came from the ancient air conditioning unit that wheezed through another scorching Central Valley summer. The linoleum curled at the edges near the refrigerator. The overhead light fixture still had the same crack running through the frosted glass shade. Nothing had changed, except me. And that was exactly the problem. My mother, Patricia Martinez, had always been a woman of precise movements and carefully controlled emotions. At 62, she still dyed her hair the same shade of auburn she'd worn since high school, pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features. Her hands moved methodically through the stack of bills, separating them into neat piles. $20, $40, $60. Each bill crisp and clean, like she'd been to the bank specifically for this moment. "This is from the church fund," she said without looking up. "Father Gonzalez approved it after I explained your situation." Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected over decades of managing a household and a husband who worked double shifts at the oil refinery. It was the voice that brooked no argument, that had sent me to my room as a child and made me question every major decision I'd made as an adult. My father sat at the kitchen table behind her, his broad shoulders hunched over a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Miguel Martinez was a man who'd built his life with his hands, who understood the weight of steel and the pressure of machinery, who could fix anything that had nuts and bolts but couldn't comprehend how his daughter had drifted so far from everything he thought made sense. The calluses on his palms told the story of 38 years at Chevron, of overtime shifts and weekend maintenance calls that had paid for this house, for my college tuition, for the belief that education would lift me higher than he'd ever climbed. He didn't speak, but his silence filled the room like a heavy blanket. It was the silence of a man who'd run out of patience, who'd watched his daughter make what seemed like one poor choice after another, who'd given up trying to understand why someone with a degree from UC Berkeley was living in a studio apartment in Arlington, Virginia, with no husband, no children, no visible career trajectory that made any sense to a man who'd worked the same job for nearly 4 decades. $120, my mother announced, pushing the neat stack toward me across the counter. "It's not much, but it should cover gas and maybe a meal or two on your drive back." Back to what, I wanted to ask. Back to the life they thought I was living? Back to the apartment they'd visited once, seen the bare walls and minimal furniture, and concluded was evidence of my failure to thrive? Back to the job they assumed was some kind of elaborate delusion because I couldn't explain what I actually did for 8 hours a day? "We've been talking," my father said finally, his voice rough from years of breathing refinery air. "Your mother and I, we think it's time." I knew what was coming. I had been expecting this conversation for months, maybe years. It was the same conversation that had been building since I'd graduated college and chosen a path they couldn't follow, couldn't understand, couldn't respect, because it didn't fit into the neat categories they'd constructed for success. "Time for what, Dad?" He finally looked up from his coffee cup, and I saw something in his eyes that was worse than anger. It was disappointment so deep it had settled into his bones. "Time for you to come home. Really come home. Stop pretending you're something you're not." The words hit harder than I'd expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered with the gentle firmness of parents who thought they were saving their child from herself. They thought they were offering me a lifeline, a way back to reality, a chance to stop chasing whatever phantom career they believed I'd invented, to avoid admitting I'd failed. "There's a position open at the school district," my mother continued, her voice brightening with the false cheer she used when she was trying to sell me on something I didn't want. "Administrative assistant in the superintendent's office. Good benefits, steady hours, close to home. Mrs. Hernandez in HR is a friend of mine from church. She said she'd put in a good word." I looked around the kitchen, at the ceramic rooster salt and pepper shakers my mother had bought at a garage sale 20 years ago, at the calendar hanging crooked on the wall with doctor's appointments written in my father's careful block letters, at the window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard where I'd played as a child, where the swing set still stood even though the chains had rusted and the seats had cracked. This was the life they wanted for me. This was what they thought I needed: stability, predictability. A job where I could explain exactly what I did every day, where I'd get a paycheck that made sense, where I'd meet a nice man at the church social, and settle down 6 blocks from where I grew up, and spend Sunday afternoons at this same kitchen table, talking about mortgage rates and Little League schedules. It wasn't that I thought their life was wrong, it was that they couldn't imagine mine might be right. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," I said carefully, "but I can't just walk away from my job. I have responsibilities, commitments." My father's laugh was short and bitter. "Commitments to what? Rebecca, we've been watching you for 8 years. 8 years of phone calls where you can't tell us what you're working on. 8 years of mysterious trips you can't explain. 8 years of excuses about why you can't visit more often, why you can't bring someone home for dinner, why you can't seem to build a real life." "Your father's right," my mother added, her voice softer now, more persuasive. "Honey, whatever you think you're doing in Washington, it's not working. You're 34 years old. You live alone in an apartment that looks like a college dorm room. You don't have any friends we've ever met. You can't even tell us who you work for without being all mysterious about it." The truth was, I couldn't tell them who I worked for, not because I was being mysterious or dramatic, but because the nature of my work required a level of discretion that was woven into every aspect of my life. I couldn't explain that my consulting involved analyzing threats to national security. I couldn't tell them that my mysterious trips were briefings at Langley or meetings with foreign intelligence contacts. I couldn't describe how I spent my days because the people whose communications I intercepted, whose financial networks I traced, whose operations I helped dismantle, didn't operate during normal business hours in normal office buildings. I couldn't tell them that 3 months ago I'd spent 2 weeks in Prague, not on vacation as I'd told them, but running surveillance on a network of arms dealers who were funneling weapons to terrorist organizations in North Africa. I couldn't explain that my empty apartment was a deliberate choice, that accumulating possessions was a liability in a job where I might need to disappear for weeks at a time with 12 hours' notice. I couldn't tell them that the reason I'd never brought anyone home for dinner was that romantic relationships were complicated when your work required security clearances and background checks, when the person you were dating couldn't know what you did for a living, when you had to lie about where you were and what you were doing more often than you told the truth. "You're throwing your life away," my father said, standing up from the table with the slow, deliberate movements of a man whose back had been broken and rebuilt by decades of physical labor. "Whatever this game is you're playing, it's time to stop. You're not a kid anymore. You can't keep pretending you're some kind of secret agent or whatever fantasy you've got going on." The words stung because they were so close to the truth, and so far from it at the same time. I wasn't pretending to be anything. I was exactly what they couldn't imagine I could be. But standing in that kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of their ordinary, honest, comprehensible lives, I felt the weight of the distance between their reality and mine. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text message. I glanced at it quickly, knowing I shouldn't, knowing that checking my phone in the middle of this conversation would only reinforce their belief that I was disconnected from real life, that I was always somewhere else even when I was standing right in front of them. But the message was from James Crawford at the Pentagon. 5 words: "Need you here. Priority Alpha." Priority Alpha meant drop everything. It meant the kind of situation that couldn't wait for family visits to end, or emotional conversations to reach their natural conclusion. It meant that somewhere in the world something was happening that required my specific skill set, my clearance level, my ability to see patterns that other people missed. I looked up to find both my parents staring at me, their faces reflecting the familiar mixture of frustration and concern that had defined our relationship for the better part of a decade. "See?" my mother said quietly. "This is what we're talking about. You can't even have a conversation with your own family without being distracted by that thing." She wasn't wrong. But she also wasn't right. The phone wasn't a distraction from my real life. It was my real life. The problem was that my real life was something I could never explain to the two people who'd raised me, who'd sacrificed to give me opportunities they'd never had, who'd earned the right to understand what their daughter had become. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we couldn't say to each other. In that silence, I made a decision that would change everything. Not the decision they wanted me to make, and not the decision I'd been avoiding for 8 years. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my credentials. Not the fake ones I used for cover identities, not the consulting business cards I handed out at airports and hotel bars. The real ones. The ones that explained everything and nothing at the same time. My mother looked at the leather folder in my hand with the expression she might have worn if I'd pulled out a loaded gun. My father's eyes narrowed, as if he were trying to focus on something very far away. "Before I answer your question about coming home," I said, opening the folder and placing it on the counter between my mother's neat stack of $20 bills and the ceramic roosters, "I think you should know who you're actually talking to." The Pentagon identification card lay flat on the Formica surface, next to my security clearance documentation and the badge that had gotten me through more checkpoints than I could count. Rebecca Martinez, Strategic Intelligence Analyst, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, clearance level, top secret/SCI with polygraph lifestyle. My mother's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. My father stepped closer to the counter, close enough to read the fine print, close enough to see the official seals and holographic security features that couldn't be faked or bought on the internet. For the first time in 8 years, my parents were completely quiet. Not the angry quiet of people who'd run out of things to argue about, but the stunned quiet of people who'd just realized they'd been having a completely different conversation than they thought they were having. Outside, a neighbor's dog started barking. The ancient air conditioner clicked off, leaving the house in sudden silence. And in that silence, I watched my parents begin to understand that everything they thought they knew about their daughter's life had been wrong. Not because I'd been lying to them, but because the truth was something they'd never imagined possible. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in that kitchen. It wasn't the quiet of Sunday mornings or the pause between conversations. It was the silence of a world tilting off its axis, of everything my parents thought they understood about their daughter crumbling in real time. My father picked up the Pentagon ID first. His fingers, stained permanently black under the nails from decades of refinery work, traced the official seal with the careful reverence he usually reserved for handling my mother's good china. He held it up to the light, checking for authenticity the way he might examine a suspicious $20 bill, his engineer's mind refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him. "Strategic Intelligence Analyst," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Defense Threat Reduction Agency." Each word seemed to catch in his throat like he was speaking a foreign language. "Top secret clearance with..." He stopped, squinting at the smaller text. "With what?" "Sensitive compartmented information access," I said quietly. "And polygraph lifestyle. It means I get tested regularly to make sure I'm not compromised." My mother had gone completely pale. She was staring at the documents spread across her counter like they were evidence of a crime she didn't understand. "Rebecca," she said finally, her voice hollow, "what is the Defense Threat Reduction Agency?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. Not the polite chirp of a text message or the gentle buzz of an email. The sharp, insistent tone that meant James Crawford was calling. And when James Crawford called instead of texting, it meant the situation had escalated beyond priority alpha. "I have to take this," I said, reaching for the phone. "No," my father's voice cut through the air with more authority than I'd heard from him in years. "No more mysterious phone calls. No more secrets. If this is real, if you're really..." He gestured helplessly at the credentials. "If you're really who these say you are, then we deserve an explanation. Right now." The phone continued ringing. I could see James's name on the screen. could imagine him pacing his office at the Pentagon, could feel the urgency building with each unanswered ring. But I also saw something in my father's face that I hadn't seen since I was a child. Not anger or disappointment, but fear. Fear that he'd been wrong about everything. Fear that his daughter had been living a life so far beyond his comprehension that they'd lost her completely without even knowing it. I declined the call. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency, I said, sitting down at the kitchen table across from where my father had been drinking his cold coffee, is part of the Department of Defense. We focus on preventing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological threats. We analyze intelligence, we track financial networks that fund illegal weapons programs, and we work with international partners to shut down operations before they become active threats. My mother sank into the chair beside my father, her auburn hair finally showing signs of loosening from its perfect bun. You mean like terrorists? Sometimes. Also state actors, criminal organizations, rogue scientists selling expertise to the highest bidder. Anyone who wants to acquire or develop weapons that could kill thousands of people. The weight of those words settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. My parents looked at each other, then back at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Which, in a way, they were. "For 8 years, my father said slowly, you've been doing this. For 8 years, we thought you were," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Failing," I said simply. "You thought I was failing." My phone buzzed with a text. Then another. Then a rapid series of notifications that made the device vibrate angrily against the kitchen table. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach drop. 5 missed calls from James. 3 from Deputy Director Morrison. 1 from a number I recognized as belonging to FBI counterintelligence. "Rebecca." My mother's voice was small, uncertain. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" Before I could answer, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't James or Morrison or anyone from the Pentagon. It was a number I didn't recognize, with a DC area code that made my pulse quicken. Unknown numbers didn't call my personal phone unless something had gone very wrong. I answered without thinking. "Martinez. Agent Martinez, this is Special Agent Catherine Walsh, FBI Counterintelligence Division. I need you to listen very carefully and do exactly what I tell you." The kitchen seemed to shrink around me. My parents were watching my face, reading the change in my expression, understanding that whatever was happening was bigger than family arguments about career choices. "I'm listening," I said. "Your cover has been compromised. We have reason to believe that your identity as a Defense Threat Reduction Agency analyst has been exposed to hostile foreign intelligence services. We're implementing immediate protective protocols." My mouth went dry. In 8 years of intelligence work, I'd never had my cover blown. I'd been careful, meticulous, paranoid, to the point where my personal life had suffered. I'd sacrificed relationships, family time, normal human connections, all to maintain the compartmentalization that kept me safe and kept my work effective. "How?" I asked. "We're still investigating, but we have intercepts suggesting that your real name and assignment have been circulated among at least 3 different networks we've been monitoring. We need you to assume you're being watched and act accordingly." Through the kitchen window, I could see Mrs. Peterson across the street watering her roses, just like she did every afternoon at 3 o'clock. Mr. Chen was washing his car in his driveway. 2 houses down, the Williams family's dog was barking at something I couldn't see. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago, but now every shadow seemed threatening, every parked car suspicious. "What are my instructions?" I asked. "Stay exactly where you are, do not leave the house, do not make any phone calls except to the numbers I'm about to give you. A protection detail is being deployed to your location. They should arrive within the hour." My mother had gone even paler if that was possible. My father was leaning forward, trying to hear both sides of the conversation, his face reflecting the dawning realization that his daughter's life was more complicated and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. "Agent Martinez, are you alone?" I looked at my parents, sitting at their kitchen table in their modest house in Bakersfield, suddenly thrust into a world they'd never wanted to be part of. No, I'm with my family. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Family members will need to be secured as well. We can't take any chances that hostile actors might use them as leverage against you. Secured how? They'll be relocated to a safe house until we can determine the extent of the compromise and neutralize any immediate threats. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Rebecca, what is she saying? What's happening? I held up a hand, asking him to wait, but he was already pacing to the window, looking out at the street with new eyes, seeing potential threats where he'd only seen neighbors before. Agent Walsh, how long are we talking about? Minimum 72 hours, possibly longer, depending on what our investigation reveals. 72 hours in a safe house with my parents, who 5 minutes ago thought I was a failure, and now had to process the fact that their daughter's work was dangerous enough to warrant FBI protection. 72 hours of being locked in a room with people who just learned that everything they thought they knew about my life had been a carefully constructed cover story. My parents, I said, they're civilians. They don't have security clearances. How much can they be told? Only what's necessary for their cooperation and safety. The protection detail will brief them on operational security requirements. I watched my mother try to process what she was hearing, watched my father peer through the curtains at a street that suddenly felt like enemy territory. These were people who'd lived their entire lives in a world where the biggest threat was a late mortgage payment or a broken-down car. Now they were being pulled into my world, where threats came from people they'd never meet, for reasons they'd never fully understand. Agent Martinez, we also need to discuss your current assignment status. Deputy Director Morrison wants you to know that Operation Nightfall has been suspended pending this investigation. Operation Nightfall. 6 months of work tracking a network of Pakistani scientists who were selling nuclear expertise to private buyers. 6 months of carefully building relationships, gathering intelligence, mapping financial transactions that connected Karachi to Damascus, to a warehouse in Romania, where uranium enrichment equipment was being assembled. 6 months of work that would now be handed off to someone else, or abandoned entirely. Understood, I said, though understanding and accepting were two different things. The protection detail is 40 minutes out. Until they arrive, stay away from windows and do not answer the door for anyone. Do you have any questions? I had dozens of questions. How had my cover been blown? Who had access to information about my real identity? Was this connected to any of my recent operations? But with my parents sitting 3 feet away, absorbing pieces of a conversation that was reshaping their understanding of their daughter's life, those questions would have to wait. No questions, I said. Agent Martinez, your parents are going to be frightened. This is going to be difficult for them. Try to remember that until an hour ago, they lived in a world where this kind of thing only happened in movies. The line went dead. I set the phone down on the table next to my Pentagon credentials, next to the neat stack of $20 bills my mother had counted out to help her daughter, who she thought was failing at life. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca, my father's voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. Are we in danger? I looked at him standing by the window, this man who'd spent his life working with machinery and pipelines and things that made sense, who'd raised a daughter he thought he understood, who'd just learned that the world was more complicated and more threatening than he'd ever imagined. I don't know, I said honestly, but we're about to find out. 20 minutes later, 2 black SUVs pulled up in front of the house. They parked with the precision of people who'd done this before, positioned to provide clear sight lines and quick exit routes. The neighbors would notice. Mrs. Peterson stopped watering her roses. Mr. Chen looked up from his car. The Williams family's dog barked even louder. My parents watched through the living room window as 6 people in dark suits got out of the vehicles and approached the house with the measured steps of federal agents. No one was running, no one had weapons drawn, but there was an unmistakable sense of barely controlled urgency in their movements. 8 years, my mother said quietly, still staring at the agents walking up their front path. 8 years of thinking you couldn't hold down a real job. The doorbell rang. 3 short, professional chimes that announced the arrival of a world my parents had never wanted to be part of. I stood up to answer it, but my father caught my arm. His grip was firm, calloused, real, in a way that the last hour had somehow made everything else feel unreal. "Rebecca," he said, before everything changes again, "I need you to know something." His voice was thick with emotion I'd rarely heard from him. "I'm proud of you. I don't understand what you do, and I'm scared as hell right now, but I'm proud of you." The doorbell rang again. The agents were waiting, and somewhere out there, people who wanted to hurt me were looking for an opportunity to do exactly that. But for just a moment, standing in the living room where I'd watched Saturday morning cartoons and done homework and fought with my parents about curfew, I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years. I felt like I was home. Then I opened the door, and FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh stepped into my parents' house, transforming their safe, predictable world into something that would never be the same again. Special Agent Catherine Walsh was not what I'd expected. She was younger than her voice had suggested over the phone, maybe 35, with short blonde hair and the kind of intense blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore a charcoal gray suit that looked expensive but practical, and when she shook my hand, her grip conveyed both professionalism and something else: respect, maybe, or solidarity. Behind her stood Agent Marcus Chen, a tall Asian man who immediately began scanning the room with the methodical attention of someone trained to identify threats and escape routes. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez," Agent Walsh said, turning to my parents with a slight smile that was meant to be reassuring but probably had the opposite effect. "I'm Agent Walsh, FBI Counterintelligence. This is Agent Chen. We're here to ensure your safety and your daughter's safety while we investigate a potential security breach." My father, who had been standing frozen in the doorway since opening it, finally found his voice. "Security breach? What kind of security breach?" Agent Walsh glanced at me, a quick look that asked how much my parents knew and how much they could handle. I gave her a small nod, understanding that we were about to cross another line from which there would be no return. "Your daughter's work involves protecting national security," Agent Walsh said carefully. "Sometimes that work puts her in contact with information that certain foreign governments would very much like to obtain. We have reason to believe that some of those foreign actors have identified her as a person of interest." My mother had been silent since the agents arrived, but now she stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "You're saying people want to hurt Rebecca because of her job?" "We're saying it's a possibility we take very seriously." Agent Chen spoke for the first time, his voice calm and measured, "which is why we're implementing protective protocols." "Protective protocols," my father repeated, as if testing the words. "You mean we can't stay in our own house?" "Not for the next few days, no." I watched my parents absorb this information, saw them looking around their living room as if seeing it for the first time. The family photos on the mantelpiece, the worn couch where we'd watched countless movies together, the reading chair where my mother spent her evenings with romance novels and crossword puzzles. This was their sanctuary, their refuge from a world they'd always found manageable and predictable. Now they were being told it wasn't safe. "Before we go anywhere," my mother said, surprising everyone with the firmness in her voice, "I want to understand what my daughter actually does. Not the careful explanations or the diplomatic language. I want to know what she does that makes people want to hurt her." Agent Walsh looked at me again. This time, her expression was different. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was giving me an opportunity to tell my own story before circumstances forced someone else to tell it for me. I sat down on the couch where I'd spent so many Saturday mornings as a child, where my parents had read me bedtime stories and helped me with homework and lectured me about responsibility and consequences. Now I was about to tell them about a world where responsibility meant protecting millions of people they'd never meet from threats they'd never see coming. 3 years ago, I began, a man named Dr. Hassan Qureshi approached the Pakistani government with an offer to sell detailed blueprints for uranium enrichment centrifuges. He'd worked for Pakistan's nuclear program for 15 years before retiring to what everyone assumed was a quiet life teaching physics at a university in Lahore. My parents sat down across from me, their attention focused with an intensity I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, explaining why I'd missed curfew. But Dr. Qureshi wasn't retired. He'd been quietly building a network of former nuclear scientists, engineers, and technicians from Pakistan, India, Iran, and North Korea. People with knowledge of weapons programs who needed money and weren't too concerned about who they sold that knowledge to. You mean he was selling nuclear secrets to terrorists? My father said, his voice flat. To anyone who could pay. Terrorist organizations, criminal syndicates, rogue states, private militias. His network didn't discriminate. They were equal opportunity proliferators. My mother's hand went to her throat, a gesture she made when she was trying to process something that frightened her. And your job was to stop him? My job was to map his network, to identify every scientist, every financier, every middleman, every potential buyer, to trace money transfers from accounts in Dubai to shell companies in Romania to weapons labs in Syria, to build a complete picture of how nuclear expertise was being commoditized and sold to the highest bidder. Agent Walsh had been listening quietly, but now she leaned forward. What your daughter did was build the most comprehensive analysis of nuclear proliferation networks that the intelligence community has ever seen. Her work led to arrests in 7 countries and shut down weapons development programs that could have killed hundreds of thousands of people. But that's not why my cover was blown, I continued. The Qureshi network was just one part of a much larger problem. What we discovered was that nuclear proliferation wasn't random or opportunistic, it was being coordinated. My father's engineering mind was already working ahead of the conversation. Coordinated by who? By people inside our own government. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences that had filled the kitchen and living room that day. This wasn't confusion or shock or the quiet of people processing unexpected information. This was the silence of people who'd just learned that the world was fundamentally different from what they'd believed. What do you mean, inside our own government? My mother asked. Agent Chen answered before I could. 6 months ago, your daughter identified patterns in classified information sharing that suggested someone with high-level security clearance was providing operational details to foreign buyers. Not just information about U.S. weapons programs, but intelligence about our efforts to stop proliferation networks. Someone was selling secrets, my father said, his voice heavy with disgust. Someone with access to everything, I said. Someone who knew which operations we were running, which networks we were tracking, which foreign contacts we were using. Someone who could stay one step ahead of our investigations, because they knew exactly what we were investigating. Agent Walsh stood up and walked to the window, checking the street with the casual attention of someone who'd done this many times before. Your daughter's analysis didn't just identify the mole, it identified the entire infrastructure they'd built to monetize classified information. Shell companies, offshore accounts, secure communication networks, dead drops in 14 different countries. And when I got too close, I said, they decided I was more dangerous to them than valuable to the country. My mother looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not pride or worry or disappointment, but something like awe. Rebecca, how many people know about this? Including everyone in this room? Maybe 25. And how many people want you dead because of it? I looked at Agent Walsh, who gave me a small nod of encouragement. We're still figuring that out, I said honestly, but enough that the FBI thinks it's worth moving you to a safe house. My father stood up and began pacing, a habit he'd had since I was a child, whenever he was trying to work through a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. So for 8 years, while we thought you were wasting your education, you were actually saving lives, Agent Chen said simply. The networks your daughter has helped dismantle would have supplied weapons-grade materials to terrorist organizations, drug cartels, and hostile governments. Conservatively, her work has prevented the development of at least 12 dirty bombs and 3 actual nuclear weapons. My mother was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. And we told you to give it up. We told you to come home and get a real job. You couldn't have known, I said. That was the point. My cover had to be so complete that even the people closest to me believed it. But it was killing you, my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. All these years, watching us think you were a failure. Listening to us worry about your future, tell you to settle down, find a nice man, start a family. How did you stand it? The truth was, I'd stood it because I'd had to. Because the alternative was explaining to my parents that their daughter lived in a world where romantic relationships were security risks, where having children meant creating potential targets, where building a normal life meant compromising the work that kept millions of people safe. I had someone who understood, I said finally. My supervisor at the Pentagon, Dr. Elena Vasquez. She'd been doing this kind of work for 20 years. She helped me understand that the sacrifice was worth it, that protecting people sometimes meant letting them think you weren't worth protecting. Agent Walsh turned from the window. Dr. Vasquez was killed in a car accident 3 weeks ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. Elena had been more than my supervisor. She'd been my mentor, my advocate, the person who'd believed in my work when I'd started to doubt it myself. She'd been the one who'd convinced me that my family's disapproval was a small price to pay for the lives we were saving. It wasn't an accident, Agent Chen continued. Forensic analysis found evidence that her brake lines had been cut. Someone wanted her dead, and they wanted it to look like an accident. My parents were watching me process this information, seeing me grieve for someone they'd never heard of, someone who'd been more important to my daily life than they'd been for the past 8 years. Another reminder of how much of my world they'd been excluded from. Elena was working on something called Project Blackwater when she died, Agent Walsh said. An investigation into the financial networks funding nuclear proliferation. She'd identified over $40 million in payments flowing from U.S. government accounts to offshore companies with ties to weapons dealers. $40 million, my father repeated. From our government? From someone inside our government, I corrected. Someone with the authority to authorize payments that looked legitimate, but were actually funding the exact networks we were supposed to be stopping. And now that person knows you were working with Dr. Vasquez, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. They know you might have access to whatever she discovered. I nodded. Which is why we're all sitting in your living room talking to FBI agents instead of arguing about whether I should take a job with the school district. Agent Walsh checked her watch. The safe house is ready, we need to move soon. Evening traffic will provide better cover, but we don't want to wait too long. My parents looked around their living room one more time, taking in the evidence of a life they'd built together over 4 decades. The vacation photos, the grandchildren's drawings taped to the refrigerator that I could see through the kitchen doorway, the accumulated possessions of people who'd never expected their home to become unsafe. What should we bring, my mother asked. Enough clothes for a week, Agent Chen said. Essential medications. Nothing electronic that can be traced. No cell phones, no laptops, no tablets. What about work? My father asked. I can't just disappear from the refinery without explanation. Your supervisor has already been contacted, Agent Walsh said. You've been granted emergency family leave due to a medical situation. Your employer has been told that you'll be unreachable for several days, but that the situation is temporary. As my parents went upstairs to pack, I sat alone with the 2 FBI agents in the living room where I'd grown up. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the furniture I'd known all my life. There's something else, Agent Walsh said once my parents were out of earshot. Project Blackwater wasn't just about financial networks. Dr. Vasquez had identified the mole. I looked up sharply. Who? We're not sure yet. Her notes were encrypted and we're still trying to decode them. But whoever it is, they know we're close. Elena's death was a warning. Your cover being blown was an escalation. And my parents getting dragged into this? Is what happens when someone decides you're too dangerous to ignore and too well protected to eliminate quietly. Agent Chen was checking his phone, monitoring communications I couldn't hear. The safe house team is in position. Transport is standing by. I thought about Elena, dead in her car on a rainy Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago. I thought about my parents upstairs, packing suitcases for a trip they'd never wanted to take. I thought about the $40 million in government funds that had been used to build the very weapons networks I'd spent 8 years trying to destroy. Somewhere in Washington, someone with a security clearance and a government paycheck was planning their next move. Someone who'd already killed my mentor and compromised my identity. Someone who now knew that the Martinez family of Bakersfield, California, had become collateral damage in a war they'd never known was being fought. As my parents came downstairs with their hastily packed bags, I realized that everything I'd tried to keep separate, my work and my family, My public life and my secret life, the people I was protecting and the people I loved, had just collided in a way that would change all of us forever. The safe house was waiting. But safety, I was beginning to understand, was relative when the threat was coming from inside the very system that was supposed to provide protection. The safe house was a modest, two-story colonial in Falls Church, Virginia, the kind of suburban home that could have belonged to any middle-class family in America. White siding, black shutters, a small front yard with carefully maintained flower beds. The only things that marked it as different from its neighbors were the subtle security cameras disguised as outdoor lighting fixtures, and the fact that Agent Chen had swept the entire building for electronic surveillance devices before allowing us inside. My parents stood in the living room, still holding their suitcases, looking like refugees from their own life. The furniture was generic, but comfortable. Beige sofas, mahogany coffee table, landscape paintings that had probably been purchased in bulk from a hotel supply company. Everything designed to be temporary, forgettable, safe. "The kitchen is fully stocked," Agent Walsh said, closing the front door behind us and engaging 3 separate locks. "Secure landline for emergencies only. No internet access, no cable television. There are books, board games, and a small library of DVDs if you need entertainment." My father set down his suitcase and walked to the front window, peering through the blinds at the quiet street outside. "How long do people usually stay in places like this?" "It depends on the threat assessment," Agent Walsh replied diplomatically. "In your case, until we can identify and neutralize the source of the compromise." What she didn't say, but what we all understood, was that neutralizing the source might involve arresting someone with high-level government clearance, someone with the power to make people disappear, someone who'd already demonstrated a willingness to kill to protect their operation. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message from James Crawford at the Pentagon. "Secure location briefing tomorrow 0800. Critical developments regarding the BW investigation." "What's BW?" my mother asked, reading over my shoulder. "Blackwater," I said. "Elena's investigation into the financial networks." Agent Walsh checked her own phone, then looked at me with an expression that was part concern, part calculation. "Your Pentagon contact wants to brief you on new developments. That's good news. It means the investigation is moving forward. But it also means you'll need to leave the safe house tomorrow, which increases your exposure." "Can't the briefing happen here?" my father asked. Agent Chen shook his head. "Classified information can only be discussed in SCIF-certified locations, sensitive compartmented information facilities, rooms that are specifically designed to prevent electronic surveillance." My mother had been quiet since we'd arrived, but now she sat down heavily on one of the beige sofas and looked at me with exhaustion in her eyes. "Rebecca, I need you to help me understand something. If your work is so important, if you're protecting so many people, why is someone in our own government trying to kill you?" It was the question I'd been dreading, partly because the answer was so complicated, and partly because it was so simple. "Because," I said, sitting down beside her, "there's a lot of money in nuclear proliferation. Someone figured out how to turn government resources into personal profit, and they've been doing it for years." Agent Walsh pulled out a secure tablet and placed it on the coffee table. "What I'm about to show you is classified, but given the circumstances, we believe you need to understand the scope of what your daughter discovered." The screen displayed a network diagram that looked like a spider web of connections spanning 6 continents. Names, dates, financial transactions, weapons transfers, all connected by lines that showed relationships and money flows. "This is what Dr. Vasquez called the Prometheus Network," Agent Walsh explained. "Named after the Greek Titan who stole fire from the gods. Someone inside the U.S. government has been systematically providing nuclear technology, expertise, and materials to foreign buyers for at least 7 years." My father leaned forward, studying the diagram with the same intensity he brought to refinery schematics. "How much money are we talking about?" "Conservative estimate, $250 million, Agent Chen said, "but that's just what we've been able to trace so far." $250 million, my mother repeated, her voice hollow, "from selling nuclear secrets." "Not just secrets," I said. "Physical materials. Enriched uranium, centrifuge components, weapons-grade plutonium. Someone has been treating the U.S. nuclear arsenal like their personal inventory. Agent Walsh swiped to the next screen, which showed a series of photographs, shipping containers, laboratory equipment, documents with official U.S. government seals. These photos were recovered from a raid on a facility in Belarus 6 months ago. The equipment was supposed to have been destroyed under nuclear disarmament treaties. Instead, it was sold to a private weapons development program. "Who's buying this stuff?" my father asked. "Anyone with enough money and flexible morals," Agent Chen replied. "Terrorist organizations, obviously, but also legitimate governments that want to accelerate their weapons programs, criminal syndicates that specialize in arms trafficking, even private corporations that are developing weapons for resale." My mother was staring at the photographs with the expression of someone watching a horror movie. "And Rebecca was trying to stop this?" "Rebecca was building the case that will stop this," Agent Walsh corrected. Her analysis identified the patterns that proved this wasn't random theft or opportunistic selling. This was a coordinated operation run by someone with intimate knowledge of U.S. nuclear security protocols. "Which brings us to the real problem," I said. "Elena figured out who it was." Agent Walsh swiped to a news screen that showed a document covered in Elena's handwriting. Notes, calculations, names connected by arrows and question marks. Most of it was illegible, but 3 words at the top of the page were clear. "Apollo confirmed traitor." "Apollo?" my father asked. "Code name," Agent Chen explained. "Elena used mythological references for all her subjects. We think Apollo refers to someone in a senior position at either the Pentagon, the Department of Energy, or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Someone with the clearance to authorize legitimate-sounding transactions," I added, "and the knowledge to make weapons-grade materials disappear from official inventories without triggering automatic security reviews." My phone buzzed again, another message from James Crawford, Zeus requesting immediate consultation on the Apollo investigation, Priority Alpha Plus. I showed the message to Agent Walsh, whose expression darkened. "Zeus is your supervisor's code name?" "James Crawford, Deputy Director of Strategic Analysis. He's been running the Pentagon side of the Blackwater investigation since Elena died." "And he wants to meet tomorrow?" "Apparently Zeus has new information about Apollo." Agent Walsh and Agent Chen exchanged a look that made me uncomfortable. It was the look of people who knew something they weren't sure they should share. "What?" I asked. "There's something we haven't told you about Dr. Vasquez's death," Agent Walsh said carefully. "The brake lines on her car weren't just cut randomly. They were cut with precision, using a technique that's taught in exactly 3 places: CIA training facilities, Special Forces demolition courses, and a private security contractor called Titan Strategic Services." "Titan Strategic?" I'd never heard the name. "Military contractor," Agent Chen explained. "Founded by former CIA operatives, staffed mostly by ex-Special Forces personnel. They specialize in what they call problem resolution for government agencies and private corporations." "You mean assassination?" my father said bluntly. "Among other services, yes." My mother had gone pale again. "Are you saying the government hired assassins to kill Rebecca's boss?" "We're saying someone with the resources to hire Titan Strategic wanted Elena dead," Agent Walsh replied. "Someone who knew she was getting close to identifying Apollo." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the safe house. "How do you know about Titan Strategic's involvement?" "Because Elena wasn't their only target," Agent Chen said grimly. "In the past 6 months, 4 people connected to nuclear security have died in accidents. A reactor inspector in Oregon fell down his stairs. A weapons analyst in New Mexico had a heart attack while jogging. A contractor in Tennessee drove off a mountain road in perfect weather. All of them were working on aspects of the Blackwater investigation," Agent Walsh continued. "All of them had access to information that could have helped identify Apollo. And all of them died using methods that Titan Strategic is known to employ." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. My parents were absorbing the information that their daughter's work hadn't just put her in danger, it had put her in the crosshairs of professional killers hired by someone inside their own government. "There's more," Agent Walsh said, pulling up another screen on her tablet. We've been monitoring communications related to the Prometheus network. Yesterday, we intercepted a message that mentioned neutralizing the Martinez asset and, quote, eliminating remaining Blackwater exposure. The Martinez asset, my mother repeated. They're talking about Rebecca. They're talking about all of us, I said, understanding the full implications. If they're willing to kill government employees to protect Apollo's identity, they won't hesitate to eliminate civilian witnesses. My father was pacing again, his engineering mind trying to work through a problem that couldn't be solved with tools and logic. So what's the plan? We hide here until someone else solves this? The plan, Agent Chen said, is for Rebecca to attend tomorrow's briefing and find out what new information Zeus has about Apollo. Meanwhile, we continue protecting you, while our investigation teams work to identify and arrest everyone involved in the Prometheus network. And if Apollo figures out where we are, my mother asked. Agent Walsh met her eyes directly. Then we implement extraction protocols and relocate you to a more secure facility. More secure than this? This is Level 3 security, Agent Chen explained. Level 4 involves military protection on a classified base. Level 5 involves a witness protection program with new identities. The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. New identities meant giving up everything. Their home, their friends, their entire life in Bakersfield. It meant my parents would have to disappear completely, become different people, never again be Miguel and Patricia Martinez of 1247 Oak Street. It won't come to that, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. It better not, my father said, his voice rough with emotion. Because if it does, Apollo doesn't just win, he destroys everything we've built, everything we are. Agent Walsh stood up and walked to the window, checking the street with practiced eyes. There's something else you should know about tomorrow's briefing. Zeus specifically requested that it take place at the Pentagon, in the same SCIF where Elena was working before she died. The same room? The same room. He said it was important for operational security, but it could also be a trap, I finished. It could be a trap, Agent Walsh agreed. Which is why we'll be monitoring all communications, tracking all personnel entering and leaving the building, and maintaining a protective detail outside the facility. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from a number I didn't recognize. Apollo knows you're coming. Elena trusted the wrong person. Be careful who you trust tomorrow, a friend. I showed the message to Agent Walsh, who immediately began typing on her own secure device. This number isn't in any of our databases. It could be someone trying to help, or it could be someone trying to manipulate you into making a mistake. Either way, Agent Chen said, it confirms that someone knows about tomorrow's briefing who shouldn't know about it. My mother reached over and took my hand, her grip firm despite the tremor I could feel in her fingers. Rebecca, maybe you shouldn't go. Maybe the information isn't worth the risk. I looked at her, this woman who'd raised me, who'd worried about me, who'd spent 8 years thinking I was wasting my life because I couldn't tell her I was trying to save the world. She was asking me to choose safety over duty, family over mission, personal survival over national security. It was the same choice Elena had faced every day for 20 years, the same choice that had gotten her killed. If I don't go, I said quietly, Apollo stays hidden. The Prometheus network keeps operating. More nuclear materials get sold to terrorists and criminals. More people die. And if you do go, you might be walking into a trap that gets you killed, my father said. Maybe, but at least it would be my choice. Agent Walsh finished typing and looked up from her device. Decision point. The briefing is in 14 hours. We need to know now whether you're going, because if you are, we have preparations to make. I thought about Elena, dead in her car 3 weeks ago. I thought about the 4 other analysts who died in suspicious accidents. I thought about the $250 million that had been stolen from the American people and used to fund weapons programs that threatened millions of innocent lives. And I thought about my parents, sitting in a safe house they'd never wanted to see, learning secrets they'd never wanted to know because their daughter had chosen to fight a war they'd never heard of. I'm going, I said. But first, I need to understand exactly what Elena discovered about Apollo, because whoever killed her thought that information was worth dying for. And worth killing for, Agent Walsh added grimly. As night fell over the safe house, we began planning for a meeting that could either solve the mystery of Apollo's identity or get me killed in the same building where Elena had worked to expose the truth. Either way, tomorrow would determine whether the Prometheus network continued operating or whether Apollo's 7-year run as a nuclear traitor finally came to an end. The Pentagon at 7:30 a.m. was a monument to controlled chaos. Security checkpoints processed hundreds of employees arriving for another day of protecting American interests around the world. I watched through the bulletproof glass of Agent Walsh's sedan as uniformed guards, civilian contractors, and military officers moved through the elaborate security protocols that most Americans never saw. "Remember," Agent Walsh said, adjusting her earpiece one final time, "we'll be monitoring all communications from the vehicle. Any sign of trouble, any indication that this briefing isn't what it appears to be, you use the panic word, and we extract you immediately." The panic word was thunderstorm, something I could work into normal conversation without arousing suspicion. Agent Chen was positioned in the Pentagon's main lobby, disguised as a contractor waiting for a meeting. 2 additional FBI agents were monitoring the building's security cameras from a mobile command center parked 3 blocks away. "What about my parents?" I asked as we approached the main entrance. "Safe house security has been doubled. If Apollo's people try to use them as leverage while you're in this meeting, they'll find themselves facing a very unpleasant surprise." I showed my Pentagon credentials to the guard at the first checkpoint, submitted to the biometric scanners, and watched him cross-reference my security clearance against whatever database determined whether I was allowed to enter the most secure building in America. Everything appeared normal, but Elena's encrypted notes were burning a hole in the classified briefcase handcuffed to my wrist. We'd spent most of the night decrypting Elena's files using quantum algorithms that the FBI's cybersecurity division had borrowed from the NSA. What we'd found was methodical, brilliant, and terrifying. Elena hadn't just identified Apollo. She'd built a complete case against him, including financial records, communication intercepts, and documentary evidence that would have sent him to federal prison for multiple life sentences. The problem was that Apollo knew she'd been close to exposing him, which meant he also knew that anyone who'd worked with Elena, anyone who'd had access to her research, anyone who could continue her investigation, was now a target. James Crawford's office was on the 3rd floor of the Pentagon's C-Ring, in a section dedicated to strategic analysis and threat assessment. I'd been there dozens of times over the past 8 years, but today the familiar hallways felt different. Every person I passed could be Apollo. Every security camera could be monitored by someone working for the Prometheus network. Every step brought me closer to either the truth or a trap that had been carefully designed to eliminate the last person who could expose a $250 million conspiracy. "Rebecca?" James Crawford opened his office door before I could knock, his face showing the strain of someone who'd been awake for too many consecutive hours. At 58, he still maintained the ramrod posture of his West Point training, but his eyes held a weariness that came from 30 years of carrying secrets that could reshape global politics. "Thank you for coming. I know the circumstances aren't ideal." His office was exactly as I remembered it. Steel desk, government-issue chairs, walls covered with maps and threat assessment charts that told the story of a world more dangerous than most people realized. The only new addition was a secure computer terminal that hadn't been there during my last visit. "Before we begin," James said, closing the door and engaging an electronic lock that sealed the room against surveillance, "I need you to know that everything we discussed today falls under the highest classification levels. What Elena discovered about Apollo goes beyond nuclear proliferation. It goes to the heart of how our national security apparatus has been compromised." He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk, then activated a white noise generator that would prevent any electronic eavesdropping devices from recording our conversation. The briefing room had been converted into a sensitive compartmented information facility, but James was taking additional precautions that suggested he didn't entirely trust even the Pentagon's security protocols. "Elena's final report," he said, pulling up files on the secure terminal, "identified Apollo as someone with access to the highest levels of nuclear security information. But more than that, she discovered that Apollo isn't working alone." The screen displayed a network diagram even more complex than what Agent Walsh had shown me the night before. This one included government officials, defense contractors, foreign intelligence operatives, and financial institutions across 4 continents. Apollo has been running a parallel intelligence operation for 7 years, James continued. Not just selling nuclear materials, but providing strategic information to foreign governments, manipulating U.S. weapons policy to benefit arms dealers, and using classified research programs to develop weapons technologies that are then sold to the highest bidder. How is that possible? I asked. The oversight systems, the security reviews, the audit procedures. All bypassed by someone who helped design them, James said grimly. Apollo isn't just familiar with our security protocols, he helped write them. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Someone who'd helped design America's nuclear security system had been systematically dismantling it from the inside. Every safeguard, every checkpoint, every review process had been compromised by someone who knew exactly how to circumvent the protections he'd helped create. Elena's analysis identified 17 separate instances where Apollo provided advance warning to weapons dealers about planned raids, sanctions, or interdiction operations, James continued. 17 times when our efforts to stop nuclear proliferation failed, because someone on the inside warned the bad guys we were coming. I thought about Operation Nightfall, the Pakistani nuclear network I'd been tracking for 6 months. Had our failures to capture key figures been the result of Apollo's interference? Had the weapons-grade materials that had disappeared from supposedly secure facilities been stolen? Or had they been deliberately diverted by someone with the authority to authorize their transfer? Who else knows about this? I asked. Including you and me? 6 people. Elena made sure that her investigation stayed compartmentalized because she suspected that Apollo had access to routine intelligence briefings. And now Elena's dead. And now Elena's dead, James confirmed, along with 4 other people who were working on different aspects of the same investigation. He pulled up another file, this one containing photographs and biographical information for the analysts who died in suspicious accidents. Dr. Sarah Kim, nuclear materials inspector, found dead at the bottom of her apartment building's stairwell. Michael Torres, weapons systems analyst, suffered a heart attack during his morning jog despite being in perfect health. Jennifer Walsh, nuclear facility security specialist, died in a single-car accident on a clear night with perfect visibility. All of them had clearance levels that would have given them access to Elena's research, James said. All of them had been asking questions about discrepancies in nuclear materials inventories. All of them died within 6 months of each other. Which means Apollo knows who's investigating him, I said. Which means Apollo has been systematically eliminating anyone who might expose the Prometheus network. James activated another security protocol, one that disabled all recording devices in the room and generated an electromagnetic field that would prevent external surveillance. What I'm about to show you cannot leave this room. Elena's final discovery was that Apollo isn't just stealing nuclear materials. He's been manipulating U.S. foreign policy to create markets for those materials. The screen displayed a series of classified documents that showed U.S. diplomatic positions, military deployment decisions, and foreign aid allocations that had all been influenced by recommendations from Apollo's position within the government. Look at this, James said, highlighting a memo dated 18 months earlier. The U.S. decided to withdraw support for nuclear disarmament programs in 3 former Soviet republics. That decision was based on a strategic assessment written by Apollo. 6 months later, weapons-grade materials from those same republics appeared on the black market. He created the instability that generated the supply, I said, understanding the horrifying elegance of the scheme. And then he profited from selling the materials that became available because of that instability, James confirmed. Apollo has been orchestrating conflicts, undermining peace agreements, and destabilizing nuclear security arrangements, all to create more opportunities for weapons trafficking. I stared at the documents, trying to process the scope of what I was seeing. This wasn't just theft or corruption. This was someone inside the U.S. government deliberately making the world more dangerous in order to profit from that danger. Elena figured out who he is, I said. James nodded gravely. She figured out who he is, how he's been operating, and most importantly, how to prove it. He pulled out a secure drive, no bigger than a thumb drive, but containing encryption that would take centuries to break without the proper authorization codes. Elena's complete files. Financial records, communication intercepts, documentary evidence, witness statements from assets inside the weapons trafficking networks. Everything needed to build an airtight case against Apollo, and everyone working with him. Why are you giving this to me instead of turning it over to the Justice Department? Because, James said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, we're not sure how high this conspiracy goes. Apollo has been operating for 7 years without being detected. That kind of access, that level of protection, suggests he has allies in places we haven't identified yet. I took the secure drive, feeling the weight of everything Elena had died for. What's the plan? You're going to complete Elena's investigation. You're going to identify every member of the Prometheus network, trace every financial transaction, and build a case so comprehensive that no amount of political protection can save them. And Apollo? Apollo is going to try to kill you before you can finish, James said bluntly, which is why you're not doing this alone. He activated another screen that showed surveillance footage from locations around the world. Shipping ports, airports, government buildings, private residences. We've been tracking Apollo's network for the past 3 weeks, ever since Elena's death. We know who his contacts are, where his money flows, how his operations are structured. You've been setting a trap. We've been setting multiple traps. The question is whether Apollo walks into one of them before he eliminates everyone who can testify against him. My secure phone buzzed with a message from Agent Walsh. Unusual activity at safe house location. Recommend immediate extraction protocol. I showed the message to James, whose expression darkened. Your parents? Could be a false alarm, I said, though I didn't believe it. Could be Apollo making his next move, James replied. If he can't get to you directly, he'll use leverage. I stood up, the classified briefcase still handcuffed to my wrist, Elena's secure drive now burning a hole in my pocket. I have to go. Rebecca, James said as I reached for the door. Elena's investigation revealed something else. Apollo knows about your family. He knows where they live, where they work, who their friends are. This isn't just about stopping you from continuing her work. This is about sending a message to anyone else who might think about investigating the Prometheus network. What kind of message? That no one is safe. Not government employees, not their families, not anyone who gets too close to the truth about what Apollo has been doing. I thought about my parents, sitting in a safe house they'd never wanted to see, trying to understand how their daughter's work had put them in mortal danger. I thought about Elena, dead in her car because she'd gotten too close to exposing a conspiracy that threatened everything she'd spent her career protecting. And I thought about Apollo, somewhere in Washington, probably in another government building just like this one, planning his next move in a chess game where the stakes were measured in human lives and nuclear weapons. There's something else, James said as I opened the door. Elena's files contain information about a planned transaction. Apollo's network is supposed to deliver weapons-grade uranium to a buyer in Eastern Europe next week. If that delivery happens, we estimate it could be used to build at least 3 nuclear weapons. Do we know who the buyer is? We know it's someone with connections to terrorist organizations in the Middle East and North Africa. Someone who's been trying to acquire nuclear materials for years, and finally found a seller willing to do business. The weight of Elena's secure drive seemed to increase exponentially. I wasn't just carrying evidence of past crimes. I was carrying information that could prevent future atrocities. 1 week, I said. 1 week to identify Apollo, shut down the Prometheus network, and prevent weapons-grade uranium from falling into the hands of terrorists, James confirmed. Assuming Apollo doesn't kill you first. As I left the Pentagon, walking through the same security checkpoints I'd passed an hour earlier, I realized that everything had changed. I was no longer just investigating a conspiracy. I was racing against a deadline that could determine whether nuclear weapons ended up in the hands of people willing to use them against innocent civilians. My parents' safety, Elena's justice, and the security of millions of people I'd never meet, all depended on what I did with the information burning in my pocket. Agent Walsh was waiting in the sedan, her expression tense as she pulled away from the Pentagon and into DC traffic that suddenly seemed full of potential threats. The safe house? I asked. Compromised, she said grimly. We're moving your parents to a level 4 facility, military protection on a classified base. How did Apollo find them? That's what we're going to figure out, Agent Walsh said, accelerating through a yellow light. Right after we make sure they're still alive to tell us. The military facility at Quantico was a fortress disguised as an office complex. Razor wire hidden behind decorative fencing, guard towers camouflaged as communications equipment, and enough firepower to stop a small army, all concealed within what looked like a corporate campus from the highway. Agent Walsh badged us through 3 separate checkpoints before we reached the building where my parents were being held. Held was probably the wrong word, but protected didn't capture the reality that they couldn't leave, couldn't make phone calls, and couldn't contact anyone outside the facility without prior authorization from people they'd never met. I found them in a conference room on the 2nd floor, sitting across from a man in an expensive suit, who introduced himself as Deputy Attorney General Richard Hawthorne. My father's face was pale, my mother's hands were shaking, and both of them looked like they'd aged years in the 12 hours since I'd left for the Pentagon. "Ms. Martinez," Hawthorne said, standing to shake my hand with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. "Your parents have been briefed on the current situation. They understand that their safety depends on your cooperation with our investigation." The way he said, quote, "cooperation" made it sound less like a request and more like a demand. I didn't like Richard Hawthorne. "What kind of briefing?" I asked. "They know that you've been investigating a conspiracy involving nuclear materials," my mother said, her voice carefully controlled. "They know that people have been killed to protect this conspiracy. And they know that someone is trying to use us to force you to stop your investigation." My father leaned forward across the conference table. "Rebecca, they want you to turn over all of Elena's files to the Justice Department and step away from the investigation. They say it's too dangerous for civilians to be involved." I looked at Hawthorne, who was watching me with the calculating expression of someone evaluating whether I was going to be reasonable or whether I was going to be a problem. "And if I refuse?" I asked. "Then your parents remain in protective custody indefinitely," Hawthorne said smoothly. "For their own safety, of course." Agent Walsh, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "Deputy Attorney General Hawthorne, with respect, that wasn't the arrangement we discussed." "The arrangement," Hawthorne replied without taking his eyes off me, "was conditional on Ms. Martinez's full cooperation. Her continued involvement in this investigation puts everyone at risk, including federal agents who are trying to protect her family." I felt Elena's secure drive in my jacket pocket, along with the encrypted files that could expose Apollo and shut down the Prometheus network. Everything Elena had died for was literally in my hands, and now someone who claimed to represent the Justice Department was trying to take it away from me. "Mr. Hawthorne," I said carefully, "exactly how long have you been involved in this investigation?" I was briefed on Operation Blackwater 3 days ago, when it became clear that federal crimes had been committed and civilian lives were in danger. 3 days ago, the same day that mysterious text message had warned me that Apollo knew I was coming to the Pentagon. The same day that additional security had been placed around my parents' safe house. The same day that Agent Walsh had told me the investigation was accelerating toward a conclusion. "Who briefed you?" I asked. "That's classified," Hawthorne said, "but I can assure you that my authorization comes from the highest levels of the Justice Department." Agent Walsh was looking at Hawthorne with an expression I'd never seen before. Not suspicion, exactly, but careful attention. The kind of attention federal agents pay when they're not sure whether someone is telling them the truth. "Agent Walsh," I said, "can you confirm Deputy Attorney General Hawthorne's authority in this matter?" She hesitated for just a moment too long. "I'm still verifying his credentials through FBI channels." "You're still verifying his credentials," I repeated, "even though he's been here for 12 hours, talking to my parents, telling them about classified operations, and demanding that I turn over evidence in a federal investigation." Hawthorne's composed expression flickered slightly. "Ms. Martinez, I understand that you're concerned about your parents' safety, but—" "I'm concerned about a lot of things," I interrupted. "I'm concerned about my parents' safety. I'm concerned about weapons-grade uranium being delivered to terrorists next week. And I'm increasingly concerned about how you knew to be here, how you knew about Elena's files, and how you knew that I'd be willing to trade those files for my parents' freedom." The room went very quiet. My parents were looking back and forth between Hawthorne and me, trying to understand a conversation that was happening in subtext and implications. Agent Walsh had moved closer to the door, her hand resting casually on her service weapon. Furthermore, I continued, reaching into my jacket pocket, I'm concerned about the fact that someone with your apparent authority would be personally involved in what should be a routine evidence transfer. Deputy Attorney Generals don't usually handle field operations. I pulled out my secure phone and activated the recording function. Agent Walsh, for the record, can you state your full name and current assignment? Special Agent Catherine Walsh, FBI Counterintelligence Division, assigned to Operation Blackwater under the authority of Director Morrison. And can you confirm that Deputy Attorney General Richard Hawthorne's presence here today was coordinated through proper FBI channels? Agent Walsh looked directly at Hawthorne, who was no longer bothering to maintain his composed facade. No, I cannot confirm that. In fact, I said, accessing Elena's decrypted files on my phone, I can confirm that there is no Deputy Attorney General named Richard Hawthorne currently serving in the Justice Department. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences that had punctuated this investigation. This was the silence of someone realizing they'd been caught in a lie so fundamental that there was no way to explain it away. However, I continued, scrolling through Elena's files, there is a Richard Hawthorne listed in her investigation notes, Senior Procurement Officer, Department of Energy, with access to nuclear materials, inventories, and authorization procedures. Salary, $120,000 per year. Offshore banking relationships, accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Dubai, totaling approximately $8 million. My father's face had gone from pale to gray. My mother was staring at Hawthorne like she was seeing him for the first time. Elena's notes also indicate that Richard Hawthorne has been providing classified information about nuclear security procedures to foreign buyers for at least 3 years, I said, standing up and moving closer to Agent Walsh, and that he was one of the primary coordinators for the Prometheus Network's operations on the East Coast. Hawthorne finally dropped the pretense entirely. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Ms. Martinez. The Prometheus Network isn't just about money. It's about maintaining global stability through strategic resource distribution. It's about selling nuclear weapons to terrorists, I said. It's about ensuring that nuclear materials end up in the hands of stable governments and responsible organizations, instead of being locked away in American vaults while the rest of the world deals with energy crises and security threats. Agent Walsh had drawn her weapon, though she kept it pointed at the floor. Mr. Hawthorne, I need you to place your hands on the table and remain seated. Agent Walsh, Hawthorne said, his voice taking on a reasonable, almost paternal tone. You're making a mistake. I have authority over this operation. I have documentation proving my oversight responsibility. Then you won't mind if we verify that documentation through proper channels, Agent Walsh replied, starting with an explanation of how you gained access to this facility without going through FBI security protocols. For the first time since we'd entered the room, Hawthorne looked genuinely worried. I was escorted by facility security. No, you weren't, Agent Walsh said. I checked. There's no record of you being cleared through any of our security checkpoints, which means you either have access credentials that override our security systems, or you had help from someone inside this facility. I thought about Apollo, still hidden somewhere in the government, still coordinating the Prometheus Network's operations, still working to eliminate anyone who could expose his conspiracy. If Hawthorne was here, if he'd gained access to my parents and tried to manipulate me into giving up Elena's evidence, it meant Apollo knew exactly where we were and exactly what we were doing. Agent Walsh, I said, I think we need to assume that this facility has been compromised. She nodded grimly. I think you're right. My secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from James Crawford at the Pentagon. I answered it immediately. Rebecca, where are you right now? His voice was tight with urgency. Quantico with my parents and Agent Walsh. You need to leave immediately. We've intercepted communications indicating that the Prometheus Network is planning to eliminate all remaining witnesses today. That includes you, your parents, and anyone who's been protecting you. Through the conference room window, I could see black SUVs pulling up in the facility's parking lot. Too many SUVs, arriving too quickly, with too many occupants who were moving with military precision toward the building entrance. How many vehicles? Agent Walsh asked, joining me at the window. 6, maybe 8 people per vehicle. Titan Strategic, she said grimly, Apollo's personal cleanup crew. My father stood up from the conference table, his face showing the determination that had carried him through 38 years of dangerous work in oil refineries. What do we do? Agent Walsh was already moving toward the door. We get out of here through the emergency exit. Now. But as she reached for the door handle, it opened from the outside. A man in tactical gear stepped into the room, followed by 2 others carrying weapons that were definitely not standard government issue. Nobody moves, the lead man said calmly. Nobody reaches for phones, weapons, or panic buttons. We're here to resolve a situation quietly and professionally. Hawthorne, who had been sitting frozen at the conference table since his identity was exposed, suddenly looked relieved. Thank you for coming. Ms. Martinez has been uncooperative, and Agent Walsh has exceeded her authority. Mr. Hawthorne, the tactical team leader said, you're also coming with us. The relief on Hawthorne's face disappeared instantly. That wasn't the arrangement. The arrangement changed when you allowed yourself to be exposed, the team leader replied. Apollo doesn't leave loose ends. I looked at my parents, standing together by the conference table, holding hands for the first time I could remember in years. They'd spent 8 years thinking their daughter was a failure, and now they were about to die because she'd been too successful at a job they'd never understood. But they weren't looking at me with fear or regret. They were looking at me with something I'd never seen before, absolute trust. Trust that I would find a way out of this situation. Trust that their daughter, who they'd finally learned was exactly who she'd always claimed to be, would protect them the same way she'd been protecting millions of strangers for 8 years. I still had Elena's secure drive in my pocket. I still had all the evidence needed to expose Apollo and shut down the Prometheus network. But more importantly, I had something that Elena had never had when she'd died alone in her car 3 weeks ago. I had people worth fighting for. Agent Walsh, I said quietly, remember what you told me about thunderstorms? She nodded slightly, understanding immediately. Well, I said, looking directly at the tactical team leader, I think we're about to have some very severe weather. The word thunderstorm had barely left my lips when the building's fire suppression system activated, filling the conference room with thick foam that made it impossible to see more than 3 feet in any direction. Emergency lighting bathed everything in pulsing red. And somewhere in the chaos that followed, Agent Walsh proved that FBI counterintelligence training included a lot more than just investigating financial crimes. By the time the foam cleared, 3 members of Titan Strategic were unconscious on the conference room floor, Richard Hawthorne was handcuffed to a chair, and my parents were looking at their daughter with expressions that suggested they were finally beginning to understand exactly what kind of work she'd been doing for the past 8 years. Rebecca, my mother said, wiping foam from her eyes. What happens now? I looked at Elena's secure drive, still safe in my pocket, and thought about Apollo, somewhere in Washington, probably watching his carefully planned operation fall apart in real time. Now, I said, we finish what Elena started. The secure conference room at FBI headquarters in Washington was different from every other room I'd been in during this investigation. No windows, no decorative touches, no attempt to make anyone feel comfortable. Just steel tables, industrial lighting, and the kind of atmosphere that said serious people were about to make serious decisions about serious problems. My parents sat beside me, still processing everything that had happened in the past 72 hours. My father kept looking at his hands as if he couldn't quite believe they belonged to someone whose daughter was sitting in FBI headquarters discussing nuclear terrorism. My mother had traded her usual auburn bun for a simple ponytail, and I realized it was the first time I'd seen her hair down since I was a teenager. Agent Walsh placed Elena's decrypted files on the table in front of Deputy Director Morrison, a woman whose reputation for methodical precision had made her legendary within the Bureau. Next to those files sat transcripts of Richard Hawthorne's confession, financial records showing $8 million in offshore accounts, and communication intercepts that traced the Prometheus network's operations across 4 continents. The uranium shipment was intercepted this morning, Morrison announced without preamble. Romanian authorities, working with our intelligence, seized 47 kilograms of weapons-grade material at the port of Constanta. 3 suspected buyers are in custody, along with the entire transportation network. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was there. 47 kilograms was enough to build multiple nuclear weapons. Enough to level city blocks, kill hundreds of thousands of people, change the course of history. And it was now in secure storage instead of the hands of terrorists. "What about Apollo?" I asked. Morrison's expression darkened. "Apollo has been neutralized." The way she said neutralized could have meant arrested, could have meant eliminated, could have meant any number of things that the FBI preferred not to discuss in detail. "Who was he?" my father asked, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived. Morrison looked at Agent Walsh, who nodded slightly. "Dr. Marcus Webb, Assistant Secretary of Energy for Nuclear Security. 28 years of government service. Security clearance dating back to 1987. Access to every nuclear facility and weapons program in the United States." "Siki Ho Webb," my mother repeated. "I've seen that name in the news." "He testified before Congress about nuclear security protocols," Morrison confirmed. "He advised 3 presidents on weapons policy. He helped write the international treaties that were supposed to prevent exactly the kind of proliferation network he was operating." The irony was staggering. The man responsible for protecting America's nuclear secrets had been selling them to the highest bidder for 7 years. The person charged with preventing nuclear terrorism had been enabling it. The official who appeared on television to reassure Americans about their security had been systematically undermining that security for personal profit. "How did you identify him?" I asked. Agent Walsh answered. Elena's final piece of evidence was a voice print analysis. She'd been recording conversations with various officials during her investigation, comparing speech patterns against communications intercepts from the Prometheus network. Webb's voice matched conversations with weapons dealers in Pakistan, arms brokers in Eastern Europe, and financial coordinators in the Middle East. "She knew who Apollo was before she died," I said. "She knew, but she didn't have enough evidence to prove it," Morrison replied. "Her death was meant to ensure that evidence was never gathered." What Webb didn't anticipate was that she'd already transmitted her files to you through encrypted channels, or that you'd be capable of completing her investigation. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand. "Dr. Vasquez trusted you to finish what she started." "Elena trusted me because she knew what it was like to have a family that didn't understand her work," I said. "She knew what it cost to choose protecting strangers over protecting the people closest to you." Morrison stood up and walked to the room's only decoration, a framed photo of the FBI Academy at Quantico, where agents learn to put service above self-interest, duty above comfort, justice above convenience. "Ms. Martinez," she said, "the Bureau would like to offer you a position. Special Agent, Counterintelligence Division, with assignment to a new task force focused on preventing the kind of conspiracy we've just dismantled." The offer hung in the air like a question I'd been asking myself for 8 years without realizing it. A chance to do the work I'd been doing, but with official recognition, with colleagues who understood the mission, with the support of an organization that valued truth over convenience. "What about my family?" I asked. "What about us?" my father said, surprising everyone. "Rebecca, for 8 years we've been asking you to give up your work and come home. But your work is protecting people like us. People who get to sleep safely because someone like you is willing to lose sleep for them." "We were wrong," my mother added. "We thought you were wasting your education, your potential, your life. But you were using all of those things exactly the way they were meant to be used. To make the world better for people you'd never meet." I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw something I'd never seen before. Not pride in my achievements, not relief that I wasn't actually a failure, but understanding. Understanding why I'd chosen work that required secrecy, why I'd accepted a life that looked empty from the outside, why I'd been willing to let them think poorly of me rather than compromise my mission. "The new task force," Morrison continued, "would be based here in Washington, but with field assignments around the world. The work would be similar to what you've been doing, but with official authority and comprehensive support." "And my parents?" "Would be relocated to a secure community where other families of intelligence operatives live." Still civilian lives, but with understanding neighbors and appropriate security protocols. My father was nodding slowly. A place where people understand why your daughter can't tell you exactly what she does for a living. A place where consulting is understood to mean something more important than anyone wants to discuss, my mother added. Agent Walsh had been quiet during this conversation, but now she leaned forward. There's something else you should know. Webb wasn't the only government official involved in the Prometheus network. Elena's investigation identified at least 6 others in various agencies. The task force would be responsible for finding them, building cases against them, and making sure this kind of systematic betrayal never happens again. 6 more officials. 6 more people who'd taken oaths to protect American security and had instead sold that security to foreign adversaries. 6 more conspirators who'd put millions of lives at risk for personal profit. How long would this investigation take, I asked. Years, Morrison said honestly. Possibly decades. The networks Elena identified span multiple countries, involve hundreds of individuals, and connect to terrorist organizations, criminal syndicates, and hostile governments around the world. I thought about Elena, dead in her car because she'd gotten too close to the truth. I thought about the 4 other analysts who'd died in suspicious accidents. I thought about the 47 kilograms of uranium that would have become nuclear weapons if not for their sacrifice. And I thought about all the people, millions of people, who would never know that their safety had depended on analysts working in anonymous government buildings, following money trails and communication patterns, building cases against threats they'd never see coming. I'll take the position, I said. Morrison smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Welcome to the FBI, Agent Martinez. The badge ceremony was small, private, held in the same conference room where I'd accepted the position. My parents were the only family members present, but Agent Walsh was there, along with James Crawford from the Pentagon, and a half-dozen other officials whose names I'd never heard, but whose work had made Elena's investigation possible. When Morrison pinned the badge to my jacket, my mother started crying. Not the quiet tears of someone overwhelmed by circumstances, but the proud tears of someone watching their child achieve something significant. I'm sorry, she whispered to me afterward. I'm sorry we didn't understand. I'm sorry we made you choose between your family and your mission. You didn't make me choose, I said. The work required secrecy. That was never your fault. But we made it harder, my father said. We made you carry the burden of protecting people while also carrying the burden of disappointing us. He was right. For 8 years, I'd been fighting 2 wars simultaneously, the official war against nuclear proliferation and the personal war against my family's disapproval. The second war had been more exhausting than the first because it was the one I couldn't win through skill, dedication, or careful analysis. It was the war one could only win by giving up everything I believed was important. It's over now, I said. Both wars are over. 3 months later, I was working out of a secure facility in Northern Virginia, leading a team of analysts focused on identifying and dismantling proliferation networks around the world. My parents had moved to a community in Maryland, where their neighbors included the families of CIA operatives, NSA analysts, and military intelligence officers. People who understood that consulting meant important work that couldn't be discussed at dinner parties. My mother had joined a book club where half the members were married to people with security clearances. My father had found work as a civilian contractor at a naval facility, using his engineering expertise to maintain systems that supported national security operations. They'd both found their own ways to contribute to the mission that had shaped their daughter's life. The Prometheus network investigation was ongoing. We'd identified financial transfers totaling over $400 million, arrested 37 individuals across 12 countries, and prevented the delivery of nuclear materials to at least 15 different terrorist organizations and criminal syndicates. But more importantly, we'd proven that systematic betrayal could be exposed, that conspiracies involving the highest levels of government could be unraveled, and that people willing to sacrifice everything for the truth could ultimately prevail against people willing to sacrifice everything for profit. Elena's memorial service was held at Arlington National Cemetery, with full honors despite the classified nature of her work. The inscription on her headstone read simply, Dr. Elena Vasquez, 1963 to 2024, she protected those who could not protect themselves. I visited her grave every month, usually alone, sometimes with my parents. I told her about the cases we'd solved, the networks we'd dismantled, the lives we'd saved. I told her about the new analysts we'd recruited, the international partnerships we'd built, the systematic changes we'd implemented to prevent another Apollo from operating undetected. And I told her about my family, who'd finally learned that their daughter's work was exactly as important as she'd always claimed it was, even when she couldn't explain why. Standing at Elena's grave 6 months after her death, I realized something that had taken me years to understand. The work we did, protecting people from threats they'd never see, preventing disasters they'd never know were possible, fighting wars they'd never know were being fought, wasn't a sacrifice. It was a privilege. The privilege of knowing that your life mattered in ways that couldn't be measured by salary or recognition or social approval. The privilege of waking up every morning knowing that your work made the world safer for people you'd never meet. The privilege of serving something larger than yourself, even when that service required giving up everything smaller than yourself. To anyone watching this who's ever felt misunderstood, who's ever been told they're wasting their potential, who's ever had to choose between what others expect and what they know is right, I want you to understand something very simple and very true. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to understand your mission. Your value isn't measured by external recognition or approval. Your significance doesn't depend on whether anyone ever knows what you've accomplished. Sometimes the most important work is the work that can't be explained. Sometimes the greatest achievements are the disasters that never happen, because someone cared enough to prevent them. Sometimes the highest calling is the calling that requires you to appear ordinary while doing extraordinary things. I spent 8 years thinking I had to choose between my family's love and my professional duty. What I learned is that love doesn't require understanding. It requires trust. Trust that the person you care about is making the best decisions they can with the information they have. Trust that their choices, even when they seem wrong to you, are guided by principles you may not be able to see. My parents gave me that trust, eventually. They learned to believe in me before they understood me. They chose to support my mission before they knew what that mission was. And in the end, that trust saved lives. Not just my life, or their lives, but the lives of people around the world who will never know that their safety depended on a family in Bakersfield, California, learning to believe in something they couldn't comprehend. If you're fighting for something important, something that matters more than comfort or convenience or other people's approval, keep fighting. The world needs people who are willing to do necessary work in anonymous places for insufficient recognition. The world needs people who choose duty over approval, service over safety, truth over convenience. The world needs people like Elena, who died protecting strangers. The world needs people like my parents, who learned to trust what they couldn't understand. And the world needs people like you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this, whatever impossible thing you're trying to accomplish that no one else believes in. Keep going. The work matters. You matter. And sometimes, the people who love you will learn to understand that your mission was always exactly as important as you said it was. Even when you couldn't prove it. Even when you couldn't explain it. Even when it looked like failure from the outside. Your mission matters. Trust yourself, trust the process, and trust that the truth always finds a way to surface, eventually. Just like it did for me. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.